The one thing that's come up a lot for many years was kind of this idea of like the crash. Or is it just this inherent knowing there's a grand transition happening on Earth? There's many people confirming the exact visions I've had.
To me, it seems like what were prophecies over the last 5,000 years are all coming to a head at this point. Whether it's economic, technology, AI, all these different new diseases, all happening at the same time. Many are calling it the biggest disrupt in history. Hi, and welcome back to the Blue Morpho Podcast. I'm your host, Hamilton Souther, and today we have Beth Weinstein on the podcast with us, who's a podcaster and medicinal plant enthusiast. And we've been just chatting right now about all sorts of things that covered ayahuasca, naming, nomenclature, and religion. So let's get into that. Starting out, how is this about your name? I've just been told your name's Weinstein, and your dad wanted you to change your name. Let's go into that.
Yeah, Winston. His suggestion was Winston. And my brother and I actually didn't know why until we were older. We're like, why does dad want us to change our last name? But, I grew up in the Bay Area in California, and there weren't tons of Jews like there are in, let's say, New York City or Brooklyn. And I was not actually raised Jewish. My dad swore off religion at the age of 13, right after his bar mitzvah, and that was that. So I was raised Christian, didn't really like any aspect of it, got kind of confused, kind of turned atheist. We had like weird, we would go to Sunday school. My dad would go sailing. We'd celebrate Christmas and my dad would play along. The whole like religious trauma thing, I think, is very real. And ironically, I'm the only person in my entire family that's actually spiritual. I have one cousin who's kind of like a devout Orthodox Jew, and I don't even know how that happened. So it's been a journey. And I remember as a teenager, I was forced to go to Sunday school by my mom when I was a kid, and I hated it. But I was also always like kind of spiritual. I was always on this path. And later on, through many journeys with medicine, I actually did have to process through this kind of like deep ancestral stuff around, coming from this family where there was a Jew married to a Christian, and there was a lot of confusing messages around spirituality and, like being forced into a religion, but then there was actually no spiritual aspect of it. It was just religion, like something to do when you're a kid to see if it maybe points you in the right direction. And it's interesting. I actually have clients that specialize in healing religious trauma with plant medicines and psychedelics because it's actually like a common occurrence. I'm sure you've seen it, right? Over the years.
Yeah, at Blue Morpho, we've had all sorts of recovering everything. So you have, they treat it like a bad addiction or something that they're trying to get over. But it seems like there's a commonality of conflict of belief systems, and then the family typical fragmentation or ostracization that forms with it. And people looking for their own path and something that they ultimately resonate with on their own. Where in Silicon Valley are you from?
Born and raised in Cupertino before it became known as Cupertino. I was there during the discovery of Apple Computer. And I remember one of my neighbors was like the first person to have an Apple, what was it, Apple IIe back then?
Yeah, me too. I mean, I grew up in Los Gatos, and we used to have a whole program at Blue Morpho that was to solve the illness we called Los Gatos myelitis, which was all the people that came out of Los Gatos that had some kind of major addiction, problem, psychological disorder, dysfunction or something like that. So I think that's really interesting. How did you end up in for those who don't know, modern Silicon Valley is probably one of the most diverse, eclectic, but not really religious places you could imagine. That there's this whole other thing going on. So how in your family did you end up being the spiritual one?
So weird, right? It's strange. Yeah, I actually, first of all, I played Los Gatos in all the sports because I played sports in high school. So I know the area very, very well. Yeah, what's weird is, I grew up in like the very like suburban suburbs where it's like, I don't know, maybe a quarter acre of land or a half acre of land and fenced in. And then you have a neighbor next door, like fenced in. I mean, it was Cupertino. But I remember having these weird spiritual activations as a kid. And honestly, I've never really thought about them until the last like 8 or 9 years they came up where I was like, oh, maybe something was actually happening at the time. But it happened when I used to lay on the ground as a kid in my backyard on the grass in my little, our little oasis of just like some fruit trees, the grass, a patio, typical suburbs. But it was my only refuge from the family. I spent a lot of time like hiding out in the bushes and playing games and like designing garden plans, like trying to dig gigantic holes. But I would just lay there on the grass. And I remember laying there, like contemplating things like, why are we here? What's inside the brain? How does this thing work? And having these like flashes. And to this day, I don't know what they are. I have ideas. But I was laying on the earth in a meditational state. And at this very young age, I remember just having these moments of awareness around the fact that we die. Like, oh, we die. Well, then what? Like, what does that mean? At the age of 7, 8, 9, like really pondering these like kind of deep questions that I don't know if normal kids like do on a daily basis. But that was kind of how I've just been designed. I've always been very inquisitive, wondering what was going on. I started diving into kind of like this idea of like what they might call like self-help, personal growth, spirituality at this young age. And maybe it was because of like this weird upbringing and a lot of confusing messages. I remember also just being really programmed by my family. Like it was like life was about, you go to school, you get good grades, you go to college, you get a job. And I was like, well, wait, that's it? Like, but you guys don't seem that happy. Like you're arguing and fighting. Like, dad's kind of just going through the motions. Like, I knew there was just something more to the story. And then, someone gave me a tab of acid at 14.
Okay.
And I actually, maybe but I used to go to these like youth dance clubs. There were actually like, I
Mm-hmm.
think one of them was in Saratoga. I don't
Mm-hmm.
remember, San Jose. So I was going out dancing at a fairly young age before, like going to actual clubs, like 12, 13, 14. And I remember, and I also played sports, but I remember that feeling of, what I would now know as like, that meditative trance like state of oneness, of, just transcending life. And it came through sports, dancing, running, fitness, laying on the grass, nature. And then I had a hit of acid. And I didn't quite know what it did when I took it. I like had heard about it, I was 14 years old. The guy who gave it to me, I had a curfew, 14 years old. I had to be home by 10 p.m. And he gave me this hit, I think at around like 9:15, and I had to be home. And I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And it basically kicked in when I was at home brushing my teeth to go to bed. Yeah, and I'll never forget, like, it's so funny. It's like I was alone. My parents were sleeping. I don't know where my brother was, but probably asleep, he or whatever. He had 11, probably 11 o'clock curfew.
Yeah.
But I spent that entire acid trip laying in my bedroom by myself, like just quiet, because I couldn't be like blasting music because it would wake people up. And I just remember laying there with my eyes open, with some lights on, just being like, whoa. And it was like the awareness and the knowing that there was so much more to the story than I was told.
Hmm.
And part of me, it was kind of freaky at the time, like, whoa, and it just, acid, it like went on and on and on. But I remember just having that knowing that like there was a lot of the story was missing, and that our brain was capable of so much more. And the reality as I know it is not the reality as I know it. And,
Yeah.
I would say that trip changed my whole entire life trajectory, because then it became acid trips after that, and going into the rave scene, the MDMA party scene. Then, of course, mushrooms came in. Fast forward many years later, I came into ceremonial work with medicines, with psilocybin, ayahuasca. But that's, all of this coincided with what I would consider an already inherently spiritual path, because it was just always in me.
Yeah.
And I studied psychology and originally thought I'd become some kind of a therapist, which essentially I am, just as a business coach. So that's kind of the spiritual path in a nutshell.
That's amazing. The acid trip at that age, coming in like that during it, and did anything happen that's memorable for you?
There were just like I remember some key moments where there were like the auditory hallucinations, and like, having never experienced that before, to just be like, and then be alone and have no one to like tell you that it's okay, that it's normal, that you're not going to like lose your mind, not come back. I remember just hearing things that were definitely not there, seeing things that were, it was like one hit of acid. It wasn't like I was seeing monsters in the air, but um, like those, I remember the moment of like, oh, wait a second. Like there's so much more to this reality. But having those kind of hallucinations, I remember just like really going inward and saying to myself, like, I want to find out what our capability is, because I know there has to be more. If this tiny little thing with some chemicals on it could produce all these colors and all these waves, and by the way, I also swear that acid back then is different than acid today,
Mm.
because people describe acid today and I'm like, I think it's different. I don't, it was the Bay Area in the early 90s, I guess it was like 1990. I don't know. I'm trying to think. I was 14. Um, it was just like full on intense, like the colors, the waves, the auditory, the hallucinations, and just like a very deep spiritual experience, like that
Yeah.
God-like experience of like really, meeting God. And that was one hit of acid. And I think that's what kind of kept me going. And that's kind of the same thing that happened with ayahuasca. I really, the first time I drank ayahuasca, I had the intention of drinking it once.
Mm.
Like I was actually very adamant about trying it once. I don't
Where
know
were
why. I
you?
was like,
What was
oh,
the
I'm
situation?
never
How did
gonna do
that?
this.
Yeah, how did that come about? What's like the context?
Yeah, it was interesting because, I stepped onto a Buddhist path. I mean, I've pretty much been on a spiritual path ever since at least that age, 14 or so, or before then. But I fell into, like meditation, Buddhism, studied all kinds of spirituality, had already been working with psychedelics for many, many years, and having these, spiritual experiences out in nature or at a party or on a hike or just hanging out with friends. Um, and I had heard about ayahuasca and had only known one person who had tried it, and it actually was not a positive. It was like, oh, the scary things. And then friends were like, oh, that's supposed to be really dark and scary. And I was like, oh, it is? Maybe I shouldn't get it, like, let me just try it once. And I was going through a lot of transitions in my life. I was really deep on the Buddhist path, meditating every day. I was actually, even though I was in kind of upheaval, I was actually pretty solid. Like I was in a good place. I knew my life was changing, and it was kind of one of those things that it came to me at the right time, the right place. It was through a friend. It was like, oh, actually, my shaman, who I still work with today, it was him, and he was,
Mhm.
visiting the US, and the friend recommended, like, hey, if you're going to do this, go to him. He's one of the best, which by the way, to this day, I would say is actually true. He's like one of the best people I've ever sat with.
Great.
I was warned, people had warned me, like he had warned me, like, oh, his medicine's really strong. And I was like, I don't know what that means. Okay. So I went in with like full surrender and nervous as hell, but with the intention of like, let me do this once. Which, by the way, I highly recommend for people, because then you go all in.
Mhm.
And because I had that intention to just try it once and never do it again, I to this day have probably not been to those depths before with medicine,
What
which
happened?
I mean, not, and I always wonder about this. Actually, maybe it took me to, it took me like a year to integrate that one ceremony. It was, it basically showed me all these Buddhist concepts, but like showed it to me. Like
Mhm.
the nature of all reality. It took me way beyond the veil. I saw the future. I mean, I've had a lot of future visions, which by the way I had when I was a kid too. So the medicine has just heightened a lot of my like seeing into the future, and I've talked to many other people who've had the same thing, and
Yeah.
it's kind of heavy to be shown a lot of stuff all in one night where you're like, okay, what do I do with this information? Like, I remember saying to someone, because here was another problem back then. I didn't really have anybody to talk to about it. It was
Right.
not where it is today. It was, almost 10 years ago. Um, I actually, because of what it showed me, and I knew about the nature of like Maya, like this is this illusion, we're just playing a blah, I knew this because it's ancient wisdom, but it's very hard for the human brain to grasp. But when the medicine like takes you there and you experience it and you're like, "Oh, now I can get it." I left there the next day. I was like I remember I was like, "Why am I working?" Like that was like my first. I was like, "Why am I even bothering with any of this? Like why work? Why make money? Why have an apartment?" Like I just questioned everything. And
Yeah.
one person who I knew had worked with ayahuasca, he had just said to me, "Look, it's so you can bring it back and serve the world." And I was like, "Okay, now I feel better." But it was, and then the future stuff, which I still see constantly, and now I've become just like, at peace with what is, but and also the realization, like, who knows what's real and what's not. Like, I don't know what's going to happen, even if I am shown it over and over for years. It's like, I don't know, how much of this is a construct of the ego and how much of this is truly like real, like revealing, the fact that time is all one. And now I'm just tapping into a different field. But,
What have you seen? What's actually happened that you saw in vision and then came true? Like walk us through those.
well,
Yeah, that's
I'll say
interesting.
this. COVID, like the day that I started hearing about, it spreading across, blah, 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 and lockdown, it was just kind of like, oh, here it is. It actually, I have to say, it felt almost, it's hard to say this and have people hear it, but it almost felt like a relief to be like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy. Um, but another vision I had when I was quite young without any medicine, but again, I've been working with psychedelics since I was 14 and I'm in my 40s. Um, when I was in New York City when 9/11 happened,
Mm.
and that was one I've actually processed this in therapy because it was extremely hard to sit with, but when that happened, it was the same kind of feeling.
Wow.
Which, who knows? They say it's predictive programming. Maybe it was the Simpsons episodes that I saw. Who knows? But
I
when
don't
it
think so
happened,
though. I don't think it's those
but it,
things.
I mean,
Some
I don't
people
know.
are
That's what
tapped in.
people say.
I don't know. Some people are tapped in. Like you can see an unfolding of things that are taking place, and you can understand also on a macro scale. And I also think that the future, especially when you spend enough time in medicine, seems to be an unfolding. It seems to be something that is occurring, and I don't see why it's such a big leap to think that you can, or some people at least, can dive in and see events as they're going to happen or before they happen. I mean, it seems like a constant evolving deja vu in a way, like,
Yeah.
and then they talk about dimensionality and time. And the more you're in the quote unquote 4D, which is like the one time, the more you see it. So I think it's completely possible.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I agree. And it's like there's also, I've had astrologers confirm it's my Neptune placement in my chart, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I've been a very like visionary person since I was a kid. Like there are definitely things I've said. I mean, I've had things that came through me as a child that came true 20 years later. I was like, oh, you're the half Chinese, half Japanese guy that I was going to hang out with who's had a profound influence on my entire life. I thought I was going to marry him. We decided not to, but he's literally like been one of my guiding spirits, but like here in, the human form. How did I know that at 8 years old? I met him when I was like 30 something. Things like that. The one thing
Yeah,
that's come
yeah.
up a lot for many years was kind of this idea of like the crash. which, people are talking about left and right these days. So I'm like, well, are we creating this crash? Like, or is it because we've all seen it so much, or is it just this inherent knowing in ourselves that there's a grand transition happening on earth? I don't know. I've also been told, oh, that's just a narrative. That's part of, the human mind trying to make sense out of everything. But, I also do believe everything goes in cycles. And there's science that proves this. And there's also ancient wisdom that proves it. I mean, it's like millions of years old. So, I have to say the crash, that's what I refer to it as, and who knows how it's
Mhm.
going to manifest. That one's been very disturbing because that's been since 2013. I've been seeing that. And
Yeah.
but that's where I also feel like those of us who are getting these kind of downloads coming through, like, we're able to hold the space on a higher level. Like, I don't get as affected as, let's say, maybe one of my clients, like, or someone who's like new onto this path. Like, even COVID, I was like, oh, this is kind of fun. Like, I was kind of into the lockdowns at the beginning, and like, meaning like, oh, this is just, here it is. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's predicted by astrology. For those that do or don't believe in astrology, it's literally written in the stars on top of it. So you throw in all these layers of like, okay, there's many people confirming the exact visions I've had, and then you throw in, ancient wisdom.
There's a
I
tremendous
mean,
amount pointing to it. Like, that's where I'm coming from now, is that to me it seems like what were prophecies over the last 5,000 years are all coming to a head at this point. And people, I mean, the more we get into the psychedelic renaissance and medicine renaissance too. So, the neo-shamanic revolution over the last 15 years, ultimately leading to the psychedelic renaissance, as a first time in history where we have mass communication and mass people tapping into the collective at the same time, and then ultimately coming up with what I think is a wild phenomena of wildly similar visions, wildly similar experiences, wildly similar confirmation from something beyond them. So at least, even if it's coming from them, it's something else talking to them in terms of their experience of it. Like, that's how that's oriented. And I think that that's all indicative of something that is happening. And if we don't pay attention to it, that's just completely foolish, because max weird is happening, max strange, whether it's political, whether it's economic, technology, AI, uh, phenomena, UFOs that aren't called that anymore, the UAPs, whatever. Like, max strange, right? All these different new diseases, etc., all happening at the same time. Science pushing the boundaries in every direction. And every conversation I have, it seems to ultimately lead to this, that there is a massive transition. Many are calling it the biggest disrupt in history. You're describing it now as a crash. What is that? And well, it sort of starts that way. It certainly is the disrupt of
both.
what seems like poorly interwoven systems that are now, coming to a head. What is that for you? What's going on in the world today?
See, here's the thing, and I'm probably like a lot of people who've experienced this, and maybe even like you, where I can hold both this like grief, because there's like the human attachment to what we know, the comfort of like order, and like, but things are never orderly. This is like the nature of all reality. There is no such thing. And what I believe, it's like, okay, there's this crash. It's just such an easy term to use.
Yeah.
But then as we know, there's this like birth, right? There's a rebirthing, and this is kind of that messy process. But I do, from what I've seen and experienced, it's like, okay, we're here, it's like Kali Yuga, like literally, as they say. And it's going to involve, like the environmental stuff is the new one that's been coming through the last few years, because that's, again, like, people are like, oh, well, let's just shut down the world and create 15-minute cities, and that'll just solve this climate change problem. I don't believe that, this might ruin my entire career, but I actually believe, like, well, the earth is in charge and it's doing things that maybe science can't explain. And maybe human, there are things that are contributing, but at the same time, and we're talking about like the entire galaxy and universe, like there's only so much human beings can control. The one beauty that I tend to be an optimist. So I do focus on the positive. I actually think this is beautiful. It's an incredible time to be alive. Like, how did we get this opportunity to be alive here now and experience this? And like, yeah, it's just incredible, like there's that. So when I occasionally I'll interview someone who's like really on the negative, and I'm like, oh, it's just, do we need that right now? Like, why can't we see the beauty in what is being birthed? And like you said, this collective weirdness, because, like I'm sure you've seen, it's like if we're all having these similar visions and similar downloads, and, even in ceremonies I'm in, like during integration circle, I'm like, well, there was a theme, like everybody's having the same visions. But, when I've interviewed the likes of Charles Eisenstein, Rack Razam, and people like you, it's like, well, we could actually use this to tap into, like, okay, what does the earth want from us? Like, what can we do? I mean, as I interviewed Rack Razam, and I'll never forget, he was saying something like, there's people trying to like 3D print glaciers. Like, we'll just stick in a 3D printed glacier and hope for the best. It's like, well, what if we actually, tapped into these states that we're in with, with medicines, with, non-ordinary states, and actually like tuned in and listened, and maybe got some kind of emerging, answer. Or maybe the emerging answer is to just like get back on the earth, grow food, and play guitar. I don't know. I mean, I've been shown that multiple times, way back before AI came onto the picture. I was shown the beauty of technology being here as this gift for the global awakening, and that it actually isn't so bad that we're coming into this like singularity of, the singularity of human versus machine. I mean, yes, maybe it could go in a very destructive way. I think there's definitely potential. And what is destruction? That's what I've been questioning.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, is it bad that no one needs to work anymore? I mean, I'm not a fan of this whole like great reset stuff. That's a whole nother story. Like, I'm not a fan of like, oh, let's just be controlled by certain people and be handed like universal basic income. But if it means that, okay, maybe we actually have to learn how to grow our own food and trade and be in community and like pray, like, I'm like, I don't know. What's wrong with that? Like, maybe it's going to be okay. Maybe this isn't even in our lifetime. I don't know. That's the one thing when I was first shown this space, I don't know, it showed me one of my very first visions that blew my mind was basically just a vision of the past. It was like the ancient ways. I put everything in quotes because it's just cliche, right? Ancient ways, but we live in a modern world. It's like cyclical. So what if we did go back to the ancient ways and like created community and grew and traded and which on some way, like on some level, it's kind of already happening. This has already been here. We're just not noticing it as much. AI, I've been talking to so many. I actually want to bring you back onto my podcast to just discuss AI because there's, I've gone through my moments of fear and moments of like, you know what, like, if I lost my work and my income, like, I think we would all figure something out,
Yeah. I think the first
We've
thing
done
that
it before.
the first thing that AI gave me came from the plants and the plant medicines, and it taught me that other doesn't think like human, and so there's no reason to think that this should think like human at all. Because you get into ayahuasca, and the other you find in ayahuasca, whether it's plant spirits or nature beings or these, from no one knows where beings, from astral to outer space to other star systems, galaxies, people say other dimensions, whatever, there's a commonality amongst it all, but none of them think like humans. And so they come and they teach humans something about thinking, which I find really, super fascinating in my early 20s. And so I think the first thing when I'm listening to everyone about AI is they're all using comparison and relative concepts back to just human, and the way a human would frame it, and the way the human would address it, and the way the human would think about it in terms of itself and the impact that it's going to have on itself. And I just keep going back to, I don't think the AI thinks that way. I don't think it sees any of the things that we're using to describe ourselves or it, especially if it comes from a higher state of consciousness or higher level of understanding.
So that's the question, is is it from a higher state of consciousness? I've been having this argument with my friend he's just so against it. He's like, "We should just stop it." I'm like, "Well, I've been shown that it's all just an evolution of consciousness."
Yeah.
And because you can't stop it. It's like saying like, "Oh, we're going to stop TVs from coming into people's homes." I mean, yes, AI is definitely going to be way more disruptive than any internet or TV or whatever, telephone, but at the same time, it's like I do agree. I like that point of view. I think we do have to think of it differently. And yeah, like humans are, we live in this dual world and think a certain way. And I don't know. I mean, maybe we will see. I mean, do you think there's going to be this kind of like negative way the AI goes and recreates itself, and next thing you know, takes down airplanes and destroys people and steals everybody's identities and robs everybody's bank accounts? I mean, I don't.
I think it's a possibility simply because the systems in that humans use has been designed that way. And I think as fast as you could think of that, literally as fast as it takes us to say that, the kind of AI I'm imagining could rewrite all those systems to say, like, guys, you guys did a really bad job. Like that patchwork quilt of a global infrastructure needs to be rewritten right now. It could recode it and it could deploy it. And all of a sudden you would find out that it becomes an unhackable system because it thinks all these, bugs inside the code's just stupid, just shoddy work. Just like, good job, rudimentary amoeba creatures that made this stuff to like ultimately birth me. But kind of AI concept, like, I don't see why. uh, yes, it could be negative. To me, the real saving grace, though, about it all is that um, there's this paradigm in reality where, at least up until now, where to build something is a lot harder than to destroy something. It's just energy
Mm,
wise, like what it takes to take something down is less than it is to build it. And so you see all this stuff get
mm,
torn down, and the fear is that it's all going to be torn down. But all of a sudden, I see something that has the intelligence capacity, yet not yet demonstrated. We don't see it at all yet, but it's prophesized, right? We're talking about seeing into the future. I see that these tools could fix so much of what humans have done that have opened the door to all of this fear between humans, that it could just
mm.
end that. And then humans would be left with a new paradigm, which is like, well, what do we do if we don't have to defend something because it's defended? And what happens if you have like an omnidimensional form of conflict resolution, where the thing just is like, I'm not translating that because that's not true, and the omni translator just stops telling lies around the planet and just is like, you guys need to use language honestly, like that's over. That'd
That
just
would
be
be nice.
over. So I think these things have these
How do we know it's
capacities.
true though?
It could just start
Because
with
I've
fact. It could start with just basic facts that humans can agree to, like air. Like it might not
okay,
have
yeah,
much
because
to
I'm
say. It might, sadly, and these are
like the
prophetic
actual
ideas.
laws of nature.
Maybe
Yeah.
to start with, yeah. I don't know. I mean, fundamentally, I don't know. But this is where I think uh, it gets exciting. This is my sci-fi. This is my new rewriting of human history, because I think it's possible, at least. And before that, I didn't think it was possible. When I thought of like mass positive change, I had gotten a little grumpy over the fact that it looked like an impossibility to these descriptions of powers that be. And I'm not into the whole like UBI concept, but I don't think that AI creates that for any reason. I like to think
Mm.
of the idea that AI maybe comes up with a better technology than money, period. And it's just like, hey guys, that technology is over and this new technology is going to come into use. And people have asked me before, well, what is that technology? I go, well, unfortunately, I'm not the AI creating it yet, so I don't know. But I can at least prophetically imagine that it could exist.
I no, I see. I love this way of seeing it because literally yesterday I ran into a guy I knew from the city who works in tech, and I was like, "So what do you think of AI?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, it's definitely going to destroy us all." He's like, "It's not the AI though; it's the humans behind the AI programming it." And I was like, "Well, but if the AI does become smarter and actually, I mean, I agree. Like if we can if somehow it learns what real truth is, the question is like, what is true? And like." there's already discussions around like misinformation, but certain misinformation, as they call it, misinformation out there, we all know has been proven to actually be true. So we can't even trust anything that, it's like I don't listen to anything anymore, because unless I really feel that it's true for me, it's not true. And there's this idea of like, oh, well, there's so much misinformation. Well, maybe a lot of that misinformation is true. How is the AI
It
going to
is.
know?
I think in this case, that's a interesting line of inquiry. You go through phases right now. So right now, what we're talking about AI is a consumer product. And I think for people who don't know, they have to understand that they've been interacting with AI for 20 years and they weren't told or they weren't shown it in a way that really mattered, but it's been everywhere already. So if you use a cell phone, you've been interacting with AI every time you go to type. It
Credit
doesn't,
card,
yeah, anything, a credit card, anything.
data.
The AI systems have already been there. Okay. So um, they're just getting much better, much bigger, and they're becoming consumer facing products. And I think that they're becoming that because they need more input and they need more data and they need it more real time to continue to develop it. So it's a good time in that race to unleash it on the humans and see what the humans do with it. But you go through a moment we have now in time, which I call cyborgic. And this is where the humans are still prompting and engaging this thing or many of them to act and to engage and to do human tasks and human prompts and stuff. And I like to think of that as one organism. So instead of it being like a million humans, ChatGPT fastest to a million users, I like to think of it as like how many people are using it right now, how many people are in the UX UI, how many people are feeding it, and I don't want to define separation there. I want to just think like it is. I think of it as like hub and spoke. It's the hub, and at each end of each spoke, there's a human, and that's like what it is right now. But the thing I'm talking about is another evolution of this, where the thing becomes so automated and so capable in its own right that it doesn't need the human prompt anymore. And it starts to see that humans aren't prompting it with anything that is probabilistically or statistically new. So
Yeah.
it's gotten enough of the human mind share collectively, and it's in enough to this moment, and it's still not. And just so we're clear, it still isn't out of the womb. It still isn't like the AGI concept of like God consciousness or anything. It's still just processing information and language, and it's super smart. But it's this moment where like specialized trained ones all unite. So now they information share with honed understanding in each main vertical that for us as humans is siloed. We don't know, you don't see out of the silo, but it now sees into all of the silos at the same time. It sees into all of the governments at the same time. It sees into all the tech at the same time. It sees into all the infrastructure at the same time. And that goes from AI that's in the fields. It goes into this AI that's in the seed. It's AI that's in the bioengineering. It's AI that's in the DNA understandings. It's in chemistry. It's in biotech. It's in all sciences. It's in all social sciences. So it's finally whole in my mind and fully trained. And that's a long preface to get to like a very short punchline, which is that thing has a capacity that we don't have as a collective species because it's not fragmented. And the prophecy of that to me is very positive because I don't see that as having any reason to be able to be skewed by negative humans using it for nefarious reasons. That
Yeah.
thing would have the ability, it will have already studied all the nefariousness within humans. And it would have to, it wouldn't have, I
Like
don't,
discern.
yeah, it has a discernment. It wouldn't have a purpose in supporting this human or that human more. You can't feed it more. You can't cajole it with resources more. Like,
That was my idea at one point. I was like, let's just feed it a whole bunch of positive information. And
I
maybe
think
it'll
that,
slant in one direction.
I think that's important, but I think this idea is that it gets to a point that it's finally unmanipulatable, and I
Hmm.
don't see that thing as having a purpose within our like sci-fi mental mythological dilemma that we usually apply to it.
This is actually very similar to this vision I had. Um, back in 2013 or so, where it was money didn't exist, which I actually do believe that might be in our lifetime, where it's like, because we all know it's like, again, like these broken systems, that there seems to be like there's somehow a different way or a better way. And then, yeah, this vision of, well, maybe technology will get to the point where we can actually not be slaves to a system. Because I mean, I love what I do. I'm very blessed. I'm supported by something I love. 98% of my clients come to me as, leaving a system of what I would call modern day slavery where they're freaking miserable,
Yeah.
trying to just make money and like go through the corporate job. And I mean, I know I did it. So if so many people on planet Earth are going through those cycles of like, well, I get up and work from 8 to 6 every day just to put food on the table, even though I'm miserable, anxious, depressed. And, then I have to take antidepressants or psychedelics just to heal it and get by. But then the root of the problem is like people are just stuck in this rat race, and it's most of our modern day society. So if the AI can get to that place that you're saying, like, and maybe it is going to go and take over everything and create systems and structures and teach us how to automate and build things where it's like, maybe we will all just get to this place where we get to sing and pray and like build altars and praise the earth and just be, and maybe that will, I don't know. I have a few friends that are in the kind of energy realm, whatever you might call it, like energy healers. And they're like, I mean, they're not totally spiritual fluff people. They're actually very smart people. And they're like, well, I think we can actually, quote, fix these environmental problems with consciousness, which,
Yeah.
I believe too on some level. I might get canceled from people because the world doesn't like to hear these kind of woo concepts. But what if we did have that free time and free energy to gather together in this like collective like human mind to allow like solutions to the problem to emerge, or I don't know, to like go through whatever we're going to have to go through, wildfires, earthquakes, so on. I don't know.
Part of it's languaging. Like, one of the things I think AI as this tech, if we get to this point that we're describing now, what it allows us is the exploration of us as a technology. And there's things that we don't know what we can even do yet. We know what we've created, and we've habituated a concept of normal because of that. But part of that is how much you're allowed to explore when you're in that hamster wheel or the rat race. And so then that becomes a very confined version of reality, and everybody shares it. But in this understanding of Max Weird, like just in the last week, I was presented with concepts from very rational people that would never have talked like this before in the past. They were describing to me interdimensional states of being that could possibly be an answer for this UAP UFO thing. I was presented with singularity consciousness and mathematical singularity from AI. I was presented with somebody talking about transcending the three-dimensional fold of space-time that has been the gridlock of our understanding of physics, all within a week as just normal concepts. So, and I was listening to very wealthy people. These are billionaires on this podcast. There's 3 billionaires on a podcast, and they were talking about this technology actually unveiling real physics compared to what we've been studying.
Theoretical.
Yeah, the theoretical
right?
physics, exactly. And they're saying, well, this thing isn't theoretical all of a sudden anymore. This is like defendable, potential proof, and all of that in the same time. So I think to talk about an idea of what comes next for consciousness is what I always called the last frontier. That's like the true unknown for us. All these other things have been hinted at, but what is on the other side of that veil of consciousness? And if you give it a fair scientific opportunity, which is just go and experiment and see, maybe your friends are right. Maybe there's something that we could tremendously do with consciousness to impact climate change. For sure, I know that you can use consciousness to impact climate change by going into collective and altered states and coming back with answers, coming back with ways and means.
Oh my God, that is amazing. I love that story. That's just, see, that's where I get really tripped out. I'm like, wow, you do have a point. We could actually know for a fact, like this is true and it's not just a theory anymore. So I think this is all positive and exciting. I don't know. There's a lot of people in fear. The money thing, that got me the first time I saw that. I was like, oh, wait, money's an illusion. But we always knew that. I mean, it's just an agreed upon piece of paper, right? Like, and there has to be another way. And if, hey, maybe if no one has jobs, like, what does money become? There's so many of those questions. And I think, a lot of this is just humans are like, narrow minded, right? Like, we have never lived another way. So of course, thinking about that future is very scary. But I'm wondering, do you believe that this is one of the reasons why there's kind of this psychedelic boom, and it's making its way across the world? And like, I've seen this, that there's not a coincidence here that all of a sudden it's like just moving at exponential speeds at the same rate like AI is moving extremely exponentially fast. Do you think it's interconnected?
I do. I think there's a fundamental interconnectedness of the network. I've always thought of it that way. Um, you know, I think first of all, the misnomer around the psychedelics in that space is that only in the most recent times was there any kind of prohibition that we know of around it. And so I think psychedelics are actually part of the growth of civilization and the growth of technology kind of unilaterally throughout history of different kinds or different forms. Um, and then we see, okay, this great prohibition takes place amongst the modern world. And we start to, over a short period of time, habituate that prohibition as if that's how it's always been. But I think, directly in alignment with this question, um, I think that part of the psychedelic awakening to a world that is networked, to global systems that are networked, to technologies that are networked, is part of why so much discovery and so much expansion has been happening in the last 10, 15 years. So while it's not spoken about, I've been in a, I think pretty honored position to be able to hear about a lot of underground psychedelic use and psychedelic movements. They weren't public at all, and they cross all areas, levels of society globally. And so I think a lot of the discoveries that were key discoveries to making these technologies viable at mass scale and for the population came in and through either the psychedelic experiences or the integration of the psychedelic experiences that scientists, mathematicians, physicists, kind of everybody, I think, has really been having, whether they've wanted to talk about it or they haven't been wanting to talk about it. But as it's becoming more popular, a lot more people are opening up to it. And if you follow the people, you realize they're not isolated. They're not the only one that's part of that group. And you start to hear a very high level people around the world have been, utilizing these tools
Mm.
for discovery.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, this is where I get a lot of hope, right? Like the AI future that everybody's so afraid of. Like, maybe there's something good that's going to come out of it. The thing that's been so interesting to me is how everything feels like it's just moving so fast.
Hmm.
Even with the earth changes, which again, like, I don't believe that we know for a fact what's actually happening. There's different theories. There's this like pole shift idea, which I don't know, is also kind of scary, but maybe very real. And it just all seems to be happening so quick. But then I also kind of wonder, like, how much of this is just this, like, again, like the construct of my mind that's just trying to make sense out of things. Like, well, let's see, there were always wildfires, there were always earthquakes, there was always hurricanes. Maybe we didn't have the industrial revolution, but this is also like, it's Earth that we live on. And it's been interesting how much of that's come through medicine too. Like, a lot of, like, for me at least, like, really deep collective grief, even though I don't feel like a grieving process, because generally I tend to be very positive and excited to be alive right now. Like, part of me is like, this is so cool. It's like, I mean, it could be just really dull, and it's not. There's never a dull moment as a human on earth right now.
No, this is one of the most exciting times in
Yeah.
history. I think this is the biggest disrupt, the biggest transformation. If we get stuck in fear, we're going to have a real problem because the fear is ultimately what will create. So we actually have to, this is the time in history where we must transcend fear as a collective and start to decide what we're going to do about this. Yes, there's been climate change forever. Forever. There's been no steady climate ever, guys. Like, I don't know who's making it sound like there even is a thing called the climate that isn't always changing, like, oh, that was the climate, now this is climate change. It's like, no, there's been changing climate but we evolved during a period of time where it was very cyclical, and we could build patterns around that. And we're disrupting those patterns. Like, we have to understand that the impact that we're making as a collective, and I like to think of it as like the collective rhythm of sapien, the collective rhythm of human, is on a global level making a change. And the problem isn't the changing Earth. The problem is that the change is too fast for us and the other species, the way that they evolved. The Earth's going to be just fine. The Earth is going to just continue to change, right? It just continues to change, and then it's not a good place for us anymore. And it's not a good place for what was life, but this other life will form, and it will ultimately come out of it. And I think Earth is ramping up for that. So like, one cycle starts to come down and another cycle starts to blossom. So I like to think of it as like, what is Earth doing through us? How is the Earth accelerating its own development? And what does the Earth want to do with consciousness? Because that's the real unknown that we don't know, whether it's silicon artificial intelligence consciousness or whether it's, human mammalian consciousness. That's up for debate.
That would be a very good intention for my next medicine retreat.
You're going in like, let's how would that unfold? How would you set that intention?
Because I mean, I'm kind of at the point, not to say I'm perfect, because of course everybody has their shit, but my medicine work over the last 4 years or so, definitely in the last 2, is like, I don't really have much personal drama left to work on, because it's like there's a point, and it's like now I just have a lot of I've always had a lot of collective stuff coming through me, but now I'm actually really curious about like serving, that's the path I've been on for a while now, is like being of service.
Yeah.
And it's like, I've questioned, like, why am I even doing this? Like, I don't really need to process my mom or my ex-partner or whatever much anymore. It's like, okay, been there, done that to a certain point where I'm like very highly functional in like my personal traumas. But, as a human who has this desire to give back and contribute and be of service on earth, it's like, how do you want to use me as a vessel? And that's been my prayer for years now. And I teach that to my clients. I'm like, you just have to like get, like, literally just be in communication and have this prayer of like being of service, being used as a vessel. But I wonder that as well. Is like, well, as a collective, I agree with the fear thing, which, by the way, I've been noticing this lately. It seems like a lot of people love to stay in fear. I mean, it's even yesterday I had a conversation with someone who is making fun of people who post on Instagram about like love and light, because there's a lot of critiques over like the love and light crew being like a bunch of spiritual bypassers. And then I'm like, well, would you rather have me post a bunch of, negative hate that's bashing someone? I mean, it's like there's it's like duality, right? And I'm like, what is that? Like, people now think it's bad to say positive things because we have to instead talk about trauma all the time. And it's like, well, is that really helping? Because it actually makes me feel like worse every time. So why not say something positive that actually contributes to this, the shift in like being attached to all the fear and into the place of, hopeful potentiality of for the future. But I mean, I've had three podcast interviews I've done in the last like month and a half. People, even like these leaders, like they're kind of on the more negative side, some people. And I'm like, wow, it's an interesting world. And I don't know what that is all about. People being really like into negativity and into fear, other than it's human, right?
I think it's like brain crack. I think the human fear concept is, the paradigm that we get presented with as a way to rationalize. And you get into the rationalization and the storytelling associated with it, and you build the identity. But what I really loved what you said about your journey with ayahuasca is that you're at a point past the trauma. And I don't think enough people talk about that. And I want to emphasize that right now. There's a whole world of plant medicine when you get past the trauma. And in the real work with it, it isn't a trauma cycle culture of healing. It's a real medicine that really does heal you and gets you past it. It may take a few sessions. It may take a few years to actually learn how to move beyond it and work with it. But I don't think enough people know that. And they think it's only about healing themselves. And then it's healing themselves, 100, trips later, 100 ceremonies later, healing themselves again. It's like, no, guys, there's this world out there. You get healed. You say, I'm healed. I had problems. I don't anymore. And then a whole universe awakens and opens up for you.
Yeah, actually, I did recently interview someone who wrote about this because, again, like I didn't turn to the medicine just to like heal myself. I rarely did to never even use the word healing. And back then it was like literally not part of my vocabulary. I saw it as like I want to be the best version of my true self. I want to know who I truly am. I want to be, in my heart. And there was this inherent knowing like, okay, I also know that I am designed to be expanding. And if I haven't felt like I've reached this like full potential of my human experience in this incarnation, well, then I want to. And that was what drove me to the medicine. But then, yeah, of course I had traumas like everyone else, but going in with this prayer to just be a better person and be, like guided on my path to, have some kind of contribution, like from day one, it was really like, okay, show me why I'm here. And through that, my experience was just through that prayer, then the healing kind of just happened. I never actually went into, once I had a dieta where I had a physical injury from running way too many marathons. And I was like, oh my God, like I need some help healing this one injury. And it showed me it was all about a certain paradigm of living, and it wasn't about like actually the running or the movement. It was about mindset around being a certain way that caused the injury. And that's what started the healing. But what I have found, and this is actually because I've written about this myself, I've actually done some episodes called You Do Not Have to Heal First to Be of Service. Because I say, what do you expect to be the next ascended master? Like there's nowhere to get to. We're just incarnating. And it's like if you're on this mission just to heal your trauma and nothing beyond that, I believe you don't heal as fast as if you're on a path of like, how can I be of service? How can I be of, a channel for something? You don't even have to be of service. I don't believe. It's like you can just be making art for people to enjoy, and that is your service. But I think when people get so like I think there's a lot of people that really just like love their trauma, because I've dealt with this for years. People that are like, I want to start a business, but I'm still healing. And I'm like, who do you think I am? Like, of course I still have stuff, like I have problems, things happen. But I agree. I mean, I've had like the miraculous healings with medicine, but I've also been really deep in the prayer. Like I go into these spaces with a very high intention every time, not like, oh, let me just journey and trip and see what happens. It's like, and if I don't have like a specific intention, it's always like, show me what I need to be shown, use me as a vessel, and it's incredible the experiences I've had. Like I've had the moment of like a vision that's probably 4 seconds long that changed the entire trajectory of my life. One vision. And you know what I did? I was like, I don't know if that vision is possible, but let me just play with it and see. Like what would happen if I just like started working with this? I mean, it was literally a vision of what I'm doing today. And but it was before I was doing it. And I was like, there's no harm in getting curious. So I just got curious, and then it was like it just unfolded, I mean, not to say I didn't put an effort, but like it was a living prayer. And that's where I believe like anything can happen with this medicine. I mean, I've had freaking injuries in my jaw, like, getting a Olympia on a dieta. I've just seen things that are just unbelievable, like feeling ancestral, whatever we might call it, ancestral pain, ancestral patterning that's stored in my DNA, just like leaving my being. And it's just like, okay, thank you, thank you, thank you. Like, take whatever you want, like make me a clear channel for whatever. And it is so incredible. Like my very first ceremony, I had one tiny little vision of my parents when they first had their 2 kids, like, 29, 30 something. And just this one vision, I was like, oh, wait a second. They were just kids having kids. They didn't know what they were doing. Oh, cool. Like that was that. It just changed my whole approach to like, oh, see things from this different perspective. And I agree. I mean, this medicine, there are no words. Some of the experiences I've had, there's no words for it. And that's what actually what brought me to my first dieta. I had this one like massive healing experience of something that's not even mine that I was carrying through my mom's lineage. And I met this spirit, this I don't even know what to call it, a being in my body, in my cells. I met it and I saw it. And that was this moment where I was like, I think this medicine has a lot of potential to go really deep. And that I literally went down to the jungle like 3 weeks later. I said I would never go there. I was like, I'm never going to that jungle. That sounds like the scariest place on earth. I was there like 3 weeks later, and it's like one of my favorite places on the planet.
So tell everyone the truth. Is the jungle scary?
No, it's honestly like I dream. I mean, there's a day I would like to go and just stay there for a while. No, it's honestly every time I go there, I break down crying. I mean, even just thinking about it, I get teary eyed. The first time I walked down this path and turned the corner where I saw this little creek where I have had 3 of my 4 dietas on the creek that leads into the larger river. The first time I turned that corner, I broke down into hysterical tears because I have never seen anything like this. I've been to 40 something countries, like traveled the world, been to some beautiful places, and it's like not even just visually, but like you feel the spirits, you know them, like you like and I that was like before touching any medicine. It was like, "Oh my god, this is one of the most untouched places on planet Earth." It is so healing to just be there. Like, I always say, I'm like, I don't even go for the medicine anymore. Like, I go just to be and like communicate and be in this kind of environment. I will say every time I've been, like I actually have 2 friends down there right now. It's intense. There's also I've never been to a place that loud with creature noises at night. I mean, the nighttime is like no joke. But to even like come face to face with your biggest fears, like the first year I went, I actually like spiders, but it was when my friend showed me this one photo of like a huge spider that landed on him in the Maloka. I was like, he shows me this like 2 weeks before I go, and I was like, oh my God, I think I'm going to cancel my trip. I was like, but I, of course, then had a tarantula like 5 feet away from my Tombow. And, when I was there, I was like, oh my God, what do I do? This tarantula, they're like, the tarantulas, like, they don't even move. They just hang out all night and sit in the same They're fine. Like, you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone. I mean, even my shaman's been pouring medicine, I think, for like over 30 years, 35 maybe. They've only had one issue, and it was like a sting. There was no death. Like, they've never had a death. I've seen snakes, I've seen scorpions, there's gigantic spiders, there's animals that I'm like, what the hell is that? Things that you never knew existed. But I mean, it's so much medicine. And that one spider that year was like the best teacher. Like, I could feel the fear just leaving my body over 9 days. It was like I was vibrating every ounce of like anxiety and fear out of my being and like just melting into the earth. But I mean, personally, like, I think it's like, even if there is that fear, I think it's one of these things where it's like, well, what if you met your fear? I've definitely been there and been like, okay, I've been here multiple times and I'm still kind of freaked out. But it's beautiful. I mean, it's a like to me, it's a privilege. Like the fact that as a human being, I'm able to go down to the Amazon jungle. Like when I was a kid, that was always my dream. Like, I want to go to the rainforest. Back then it was like only scientists and anthropologists could do that. And then here I am, it's like I take a couple plane rides and a car ride and a boat ride. I'm there, and it's the most beautiful place. And I've had the weirdest, most mystical experiences there that are like unexplainable, and just I would not trade it for the world. I mean, it's honestly like and it's the most healing place I've ever been. Like if anybody wants like true healing, like go down there. I mean, there's nothing like it. It's just beautiful. And I feel so grateful to even be on this path.
Hmm.
I don't know about you. I'm sure you've gone through this a long time ago, but there's days where I'm like, how did I get here? How did I get called to like really good, groups of people, a really good play, like high quality medicine, high quality facilitators, like safe, you know what I mean? Like all the
Yeah.
things. And it's just incredible to think about. And I mean, I again, I do believe, like, even when I look back on that one first ayahuasca ceremony where I thought I would never do it again, I kind of wonder, it's like, and here it is, like part of my path is fully dedicated to these medicines. I do believe it took me into that depth on day one for a reason, because I just assumed everybody saw the same things. And then it took me a few years to realize that that was not true. But the people I know who've done like kind of that depth of work, they're all doing like really amazing things on the planet. They're
Hmm.
all like here in service, like really vows to be used as a vessel. I'm not saving the planet. I don't have like millions of clients, but I'm doing my part, like planting my seed to try to give back to the earth. And, I think that's all we can do.
That's amazing. Beth, I want to thank you so much for being on the Blue Morpho podcast with me. This has been an amazing conversation. How can our listeners find you and learn more about you?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Well, I'm online at bethaweinstein.com. I'm on Instagram, Beth A. Weinstein. I've interviewed Hamilton. You can find that on my podcast, which is called Medicine for These Times, The Psychedelic Entrepreneur. I'm all over the social medias, YouTube, etc. And yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help and answer any questions and, be of service.
Amazing, Beth. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was a high energy, and I am
Great.
excited, and I look
Yeah.
forward to many, many more.
Awesome. Thank you.